Okay, yeah. So let's start. Thank you to those of you who have been able to find the time to come. It's a real pleasure to see, of course, familiar faces, but also faces we haven't seen for quite some time. So that's really nice. So I will make just a very quick introduction to who is John Dupre. I don't think philosophers need any presentation for just to know who he is, but we have scientists in the room, so I will focus my introduction on what they need to know before, or what is helpful to know before John starts. John Dupre is one of the very famous philosophers of science at the level of the world, which is really not an exaggeration. He's very well known. He has worked in very prestigious places. And is now based in Exeter in England. Let's say that he has many, so he has had a long career. You have started quite early, actually, John, and it has been a long career as well. And so it is a career in with many various dimensions. He's a philosopher of biology, I would say first and mostly, but his work has been very influential beyond philosophy of biology, also in philosophy of science in general, which is becoming rarer nowadays. So this is also a sign of his influence, and he has developed, in particular, a metaphysical approach to science, to biology in particular, which means for scientists that it's at a very, very general level. You can see in the title, for instance, that such a question is a very general question. Are viruses, parasites, processes, or parts, or all of the above? That's a very, very general question. But John has also dealt with more specific questions in many various papers on his own or in collaboration with colleagues, scientists or philosophers, and both. He has been also influential on younger academics, including myself, for instance. We have all read at least one of his books. In my case, it was The Disorder of Things, which was a great influence on me on my first book, but no one cares about maybe him and myself. But just to know that. And he has more recently, so that's one of his general books. And there is a more recent book that was published, and the title is Everything Flows, right? Yes. The exact title is Everything Flows, and it was published last year or the year before?
It was actually 2018. Yeah.
2018. Okay, so that's old already. Okay.
There's COVID in between. So
obviously,
last
yes.
year.
Okay, so that's two books, and as you will see, and as you will hear, John is very well known in our field for having taken a very radical position. Let's say, in favor of the idea that everything is a process rather than things or parts of mechanisms or that kind of approach that is or sounds more realistic in a sense. So this is just for you, in particular scientists, not to be too puzzled by the approach, but I don't think it is too counterintuitive though. So John, this is really a great pleasure. Just one word also, Thomas was supposed to be here, but Thomas, as many of you know already, is positive, so he's very sorry. He's on Zoom. For the moment, he seems to be, we'll see, but we hope so. Okay, so thank you everyone, and John, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Mal, for that over-generous introduction. But yes, I mentioned a couple of things, I think, to Thomas that I might talk about, and he was keen that I talked about viruses, which I guess are at least quite topical. So that's what I will do. As my kind of may have implied, my big interest at the moment tends to be in process. So there's a kind of, this will be a theme that runs through this talk. Okay, so here's okay, so, okay, all right, thank you. So viruses, so first thing to say about viruses is just they are incredibly common. They are everywhere in vast numbers. And they are the commonest living entities on the planet by about a factor of 10. And every other kind of organism has relations to viruses, or probably, obviously. We haven't checked in every case, but it seems likely that every kind of organism has viruses that it interacts with. So a big question, I think, in understanding biology is to try and understand what these things are. And as you will not be surprised to hear, the first thing I want to say about them is that they're a kind of process, not a kind of thing. And I'll try and give some idea what that means, but I've tried to probably say too many things in this talk, partly because I know some people here have heard me banging on about processes before, so I may be assuming too much, but at any rate, I hope we'll have a chance in questions if people don't understand what that means. Second, I want to talk about the kinds of relations that they have with other organisms and point out the diversity of these relations. And finally, I think that viruses have been really very much under-considered by philosophers, certainly. And I think they are hugely illuminating as biological entities to focus on. One reason is because they're exceptionally dynamic processes. They evolve very rapidly, even within a host, and certainly, of course, within a population. So they also provide a perspective on how we explore a world, how we scientifically get to understand a world in which is ever changing. And I'll end with a few remarks on that topic. Okay, so first of all, I'll, as I say, rather briefly, so I hope this doesn't go too fast, say a tiny bit about what I mean by processes. So there's an ancient philosophical issue, goes back to the pre-Socratics, about whether we live in a world of autonomous, independent things. Of course, atomism is the kind of commonest view here, or is the kind of paradigm view here, or rather in a world of interconnected processes in constant flux. This is a view in antiquity associated with the philosopher Heraclitus, and as you will not be surprised, it's the view to which I subscribe. And something that as I say, I would just very briefly touch on is that it seems to me modern biology provides decisive reasons for embracing the latter view. And so I will say also that viruses are not things at all, but processes. So, okay, so let me then just start this bit of the talk by saying very briefly and just illustrating why I think life is process by just talking generally about organisms. Organisms, we all know, are systems far from thermodynamic equilibrium. They're maintained by metabolic activity, trillions of little events going on every second in our bodies that maintain us as we are. Now, I mean, this is the point where I think, have I really got anybody to argue with? Because the traditional view of a thing is as something basically static that sits there, and we only really have to worry about what it does when it changes. We're trying to explain why it changes. But of course, what we should really explain is how it stays the same, how it maintains its integrity and its structure over time, because this is something it is constantly working really hard to do. And that is essentially, I think, what metabolism is. Organisms also have life cycles. We have a tendency to associate an organism with a particular stage in its life cycle. So if I say I'm talking about cats, you probably think I'm talking about, you know, kind of grown up furry things. But I could also be talking about cat embryos. They're part of the life cycle of the cat, and they're a cat if anything's a cat. So a third point, and this again, this relates to the idea of things as autonomous, things as independent of one another, is no organism is autonomous, or if there are, very few are. Vast majority are obligately symbiotic. You can draw boundaries around them in multiple ways, according to whether you think the many symbionts are part of them or just kind of temporarily occupying them. I'll say a little bit more about that a little later. Okay, so that's basically the sort of reason why I think life is process. Life is dynamic all the time, and the entities that we think of as living things are actually stabilities in this world of flux. They're just stabilities maintained by all kinds of activity. Okay, so viruses. What is a virus? Well, I think a lot of people still think that a virus is a kind of thing with a fixed chemical structure, typically a genome with a protein coat. This is what virologists tend to refer to as a virion. It's the stable part of the virus life cycle. So, for example, a virus we all know and love so well, the SARS-CoV-19 virion is a large RNA virus. It has a protein capsule that sort of protects it from the outside world, and an external lipid membrane, which interestingly is actually borrowed from its previous host, and the famous spike proteins that stick out from the membrane. Membrane can so a virus is not a virion. So again, I said many people think of the virus as being this thing-like, rather stable entity, the virion, but I would say that is surely wrong. There's no more correct than saying a chicken is an egg. I mean, an egg is part of the life cycle of a chicken, but chickens are not mostly eggs. They're a process that leads from the egg to the grown-up chicken, and then circles round as the grown-up chicken produces more eggs. But the virus life cycle actually is a particularly interesting example, because within its life cycle, there is the, I guess, the most exciting active phase when it infects a cell. And during that phase, there is actually no thing there at all that you could take to be the virus. Because basically you have a lot of chemistry. You have the chemistry of the cell essentially being hijacked by the virus to produce its own proteins, but there's nowhere, where's the virus? There just isn't there. What you have is activity. So a particularly nice, from the point of view of process philosophy, a particularly nice thing about viruses is there is a phase of their life cycle, which is essentially all process, right? So, so I said, during that stage, there's nothing to identify as a thing that is the virus. The virion is merely a stage in its life cycle. Okay, so a concept that I will return to later in the talk, but I want to introduce now, is that we need to understand, given a process perspective on life, how we come to think of in terms of things, or as philosophers have often termed them in a more nuanced and refined way, substances. I want to say these are reifications. They are a focus on a particular phase of the life cycle, which we treat as if it were a thing. This is crucial for a process philosophy, because we have to understand how it is that we thought there was a world made of things all along. And I think the reason is that the flux of process stabilizes in these structures that we identify and we treat as stable things. So they are stabilized reifications from the flux of living process. And a point which I think is quite interesting is I mentioned the importance of symbiosis, and we need to ask a question, to think of what might be thought of as separate processes, i.e. all the symbiotic bacteria and perhaps viruses that live in us, whether they are actually part of the organism or whether they are just kind of passing entities that have found a nice place to live. And philosophers of biology here will be very familiar with this discussion and the emergence of the concept of a holobiont, which is essentially a multicellular organism and its whole suite of symbiotic fellow travelers. And I should say, if I were really to spell this out in detail, I would also say something about the relation of the organism to the environment, because exactly, where the environment beyond, on the kind of grounds of counting all the things that stabilize the organism, I should include the environment. Maybe the niche constructed by the organism for its survival would, taking this very literally, be part of the holobiont. On the whole, people don't want to do that for good reasons, but I just mentioned this in passing. Okay, that's really all I'm going to say now about viruses as processes, but it will again have some implications in what follows. So I want now to turn a little bit more to this concept of the holobiont and the relation of the virus to it. So again, a standard conception, which is of course not incompatible with the view of viruses as things, is that viruses are a kind of parasite generally associated with organismal disease. Viruses, as we know, integrate themselves into the cells of living systems for various lengths of time. But having just said that there's this big emerging idea in the philosophy of biology that we should talk about this whole complex system, including many bacteria, as part of the whole that is actually really what we usually refer to as an organism, we might naturally ask the question whether viruses might sometimes be parts of these complex biological individuals composed of many different organisms. As we say organisms, sometimes this is sort of mess that philosophers get into. Organisms is ambiguous. I think I've come back to this. Sometimes it just means the set of cells that we traditionally call the human cell or the cat cell. In the usage that goes with this term holobiont, it includes many other cells that are not part of this, this particular cell lineage. Okay. So what kind of process is an organism? Yeah, okay, yes. So here, yes, actually, I'm moving on to this distinction in this slide. So, and I should apologize to non-philosophers and even to many philosophers for this horrible subscript thing. It's a thing philosophers love to do, is take a word and put a lot of subscripts on it so you can use the word ambiguously without being accused of equivocating. So organisms, I call organisms one, are generally thought of as coming in two forms. There are single-celled organisms and there are multicellular organisms, which I sometimes refer to in this rather horrible phrase, monogenomic differentiated cell lineages. But to biologists, philosophers of biology, even ugly it is as it is, that expression should be clear enough. The idea is we have a lineage, starts with a founder cell, like a zygote, and it diverges and differentiates and produces the lineage that we think of as a human or a cat or a tree or whatever it might be. Actual living systems, however, as I've been saying, generally involve symbiotic into many different kinds of organism one. So I'm now actually putting this in a way that avoids technical equivocation. So I think that a better concept, at least for most of the things that the uses we have an organism, i.e. when we encounter an organism, we bump into a tree or we stroke a cat. I think that a more useful one is to include all the cells that are essential to the functioning of the cat. And this includes lots of cells that aren't part of the monogenomic differentiated cell lineage, i.e. many symbiotic bacteria in particular, and actually other organisms as well. So these are the kind of first pass at the reason we include them is that they're interconnected, their metabolisms are interconnected. That, for example, your gut bacteria are constantly metabolizing. For example, they contribute to digestion, they do lots of other things. Their metabolic processes are intertwined with the metabolic processes of the host. The total is what, as I say, has been called a holobiont. Within these systems, there are a whole range of cooperative and competitive and parasitic relations. So this is one of the things that makes this whole discussion very complicated, is that it isn't as if every bacterium that sits in you is just a friendly helper. Some of them are, some of them aren't. And this, of course, makes it a little difficult to define the boundaries of the organism. And here's the good news. If you're a process, you don't need to define your boundaries. Processes aren't really like that. If you think even of a very simple process like a river, is a tributary part of the river? When it expands to become a lake, is that part of the river? Little tiny streams that come in the side, little micro tributaries, are they part of it? Who knows? Who cares? I mean, it depends why you're drawing the boundary. If you're having a great dispute about water rights, it might matter a lot, but you just draw an arbitrary line and so on. So just like that, we don't worry too much about the boundaries of the organism too, that is the holobiont. Right. So the question though is, what are there any principles that decide whether something is part of a holobiont? And I think generally we can say yes, though I don't want these to be taken too literally, nothing like necessary and sufficient conditions. But there are two things that I think typically make it natural to think of a bacterium as part of the holobiont. One is stable association, i.e. something that is typically there, if not for the whole life cycle, at least for some extended part of the life cycle of the organism. And secondly, that it provides some benefit to the holobiont. Because remember, the contrast I made was between being part of it and being something that was just passing through and just happened to find a nice place to sit for the moment. And of course, beyond that is something much more malign that is not just passing through, it's coming to do damage. So I think those two conditions provide a rough guide for when we should say something is part of a holobiont. I think it's perhaps a sufficient condition if something meets these two, but I certainly don't want to say it's necessary. That might depend a lot on why we were interested in making this in making this decision. So, and as I say, the boundaries of processes are typically not precisely defined, which is again one reason where it's so convenient to think of life in terms of processes rather than things. Now, I'm not going to go through this. I think this is just not that recent, but a nice review of a topic that obviously I hope relates to this. Viruses are not uniformly harmful disease-causing agents, but we're increasingly becoming aware that they have lots of positive effects. There are lots of ways in which they may be actually even essential parts of a healthy organism. And this is, I say, you can read this or look up the source or look up another source. This is, I think, we're gathering lots of evidence about ways in which, for example, viruses protect against disease and in different ways integrate themselves into genomes and rather fascinating case in yeasts where they actually kill off competitors to strains of yeast that have the virus, and so on. This is, you know, a kind of growing area of sort of people's understanding of this phenomenon. There is one particularly important example, I think, is because this is what basically viruses do, and I choose the word phage here. As many of you probably, I'm sure, will know, phages are the viruses that infect bacteria. So, and phages, it seems almost certain, have crucial roles in regulating bacterial populations, and specifically symbiotic bacterial populations. And as everywhere on the planet, the commonest entities in biological systems are viruses. So, you know, we're all full of viruses. The vast majority of them are not human viruses, but phages that infect symbiotic bacteria that we have. So what are they doing there? Are they a horrible threat to our symbiotic, to our microbiome? Probably not, or we'd all be dead. And in particular, there's a slightly more subtle argument that if we had a sort of predator-prey relationship between viruses and bacteria, we would not expect stable populations of bacteria. We would rather expect oscillating populations, and this is an ancient model of predator-prey interactions, which this is a nice simple case because viruses, phages, tend to be very specialized in the bacteria that they infect. So if that's not what's happening, what seems a much more plausible option is that they are actually regulators of bacterial populations within the host that they both share. In which case, of course, they are absolutely crucial parts of the systems in which they live. They're also, I guess I mentioned, is slightly out of place on this side, but it's very interesting. It turns out that we tend to have lots of phages on mucous membranes such as lips, where they're probably part of the immune system, i.e. when you put something in your mouth that has bacteria on it, there are phages that will very likely come along and dispose of them, which is often a good idea because random bacteria that you meet in the world are generally not things that you particularly want to become part of you. Okay. So, and I guess I can't, this is really a little side point, but I couldn't resist. So, as I say, the phages are everywhere. There's an inconceivable number of them. Nobody can get their head around the number 10 to the 31. I used to look up things like how, you know, how many times to the sun and back they would stretch if you put them end to end. And given they're very small, it's pretty impressive that they stretch that far. But anyhow, there are an awful lot of them. And they are incredibly vital to ecology. And in particular, I'm amazed how little people hear about them in this sort of context, because one of the things that most of them live in the ocean, and there they dispose of 20% of the bacteria every day. And in the course of a year, release about 3 billion tons of carbon. So we really should care about these quite a lot. But anyhow, I guess the only excuse for digressing down here is many people think of the organismal microbiome as an ecosystem. And if that's the case, we shouldn't be surprised that it's one actually regulated, stabilized, as is always the case with persistent processes, stabilized by these phages. Okay. Another crucial point, and this just gets to the instability of our conception of the holobiont, which again is something that we need a process perspective to make proper sense of, is that that actually, as is the case with bacteria, the viruses inside a system are not always either friendly or hostile. they can change. And this is one of the fascinating aspects of these very complex symbiotic systems. So one example, herpes viruses, we're all familiar with as lesions on the skin, and nobody really wants them. But it does appear that latent herpes virus can actually be quite important to the immune system and protect against some bacterial infections. So here we see, again, the viral genes have become part of the stabilizing activities of the whole system, and then hence I would say have become part of the system. And indeed, interestingly, it's not a one-way change. Herpes viruses rather famously can spend a lifetime being perhaps a friendly assistant in our, our kind of defense against hostile bacteria, and then they reappear later in life as a very horrible disease. Shingles, I don't know what French for that, but you probably maybe know what I'm referring. Anyhow, many symbiotic bacteria have the same instability of relation to the host, and there's a citation there. Interested in that. So final conclusions on viral ontology. Viruses are a kind of process. Their process is intertwined with cellular process in ways that are sometimes harmful, sometimes beneficial, and particularly the beneficial ones are often best seen as parts of these larger systems that we all, I believe, are. So again, I want to emphasize as a positive the somewhat vague boundaries of these systems I'm talking about. And again, repeat, there's no cause for concern here. That's just what processes are like. And being processes, we better get used to it. Okay. So, sorry, wrong. So I want to end up with a little reflection on a slightly different topic, but by no means unrelated, and which will bring in viruses. As a kind of philosopher, some generally engaged with the movement in philosophy of science to become involved in science. I sometimes struggle with people who think, why am I wasting my time on this sort of broad, sweeping kind of ontological or metaphysical speculation? Why don't I get on with something that has relevance to how we do science, which is in philosophical jargon, forget the ontology, at least until you can show us that it matters for the epistemology, the actual doing of science. I've been hearing this off and on for quite a while recently, and here I must thank my colleague, Sabina Leonelli, who's been one of the people who has been very foremost in her badgering me to do some epistemology. And actually, this last part is based on work I did jointly with Sabina. Okay, so how do we actually do science in a world that is constantly dynamic and ever-changing? And I've even heard people sort of suggest we should really, at least if the world isn't made of things, we should pretend it is, because that's the only way we could study it and do science. And actually there is some truth in this, which I'll perhaps allude to. But consider, and this will be the focus of this last part of the talk in terms of an actual scientific problem. Consider a situation such as the current pandemic. Actually, it seems to be particularly present at the moment. So we think of scientific knowledge as the basis for a rational response to this. And we think of that because it's properly grounded in hard-won evidence about the workings of the world. But if the world is constantly changing, how should we try and provide science that that actually somehow tracks this changing world? So this, I think, is a really important problem, because, as I mentioned, viruses are hugely dynamic. They're evolving all the time, as well. So not only are they dynamic in terms of their life cycles, but they're dynamic in terms of the fact that an entity we identify as a certain kind, identify the Omicron strain of the coronavirus, but we know this is a quite different entity from the first thing that was ever identified as an Omicron virus. And moreover, there are many different versions of it now circulating around the world. How do we, can we even deal with this sort of an entity in a way that is conceived of as gaining some kind of stable knowledge of the world, which I suppose we would like science to provide for us? Okay, so I mentioned this earlier on. The concept I think that we need to understand this is something which we refer to as reification. It's been used in other ways, so this is, don't assume that I'm making any very close connection with some of those past uses. So what's reification? It's the identification in the flux of processes of some stabilities, some stable features. And these stable features often take the form of stable structures, so that for particular periods of time, this is crucial, that one of the things we must always be aware of in thinking in processes is the time scale of processes, how long these stabilities last. So this is something with which we can't, without which I would argue that you can't actually do science. You have to provide some description of something, but you have to realize at the same time of doing this that you are talking about a temporary stability in a flux of change. And indeed, the fact that you need to do this is arguably why people have been so persuaded by substance or thing metaphysics, despite the overwhelmingly obvious fact that we're not stable substances or things. So we also want to distinguish two stages of reification. One is that we reify, so actually the terminology I should explain, by object, and this is perhaps counterintuitive, by object we mean a scientific entity. So it might be a model, it might be an actual living model, like a model organism. It might be a theory. It's the kind of scientific product that we use to understand phenomena, whatever happened in the world. So we create these epistemic objects to capture features of the world. So we might talk about humans, say, and describe them in a certain way. And if we're doing something for particular purposes, we might be interested in a relatively small subset of the life cycle of the human, even perhaps the diversity of the human. Then we have to reify the phenomena by using the objects. So we try to apply the objects to phenomena in the world. We hope that we can make sense. So for example, we look at our model mouse and we infer something about mammals, or we try to. And we try to say, our model mouse works in a certain way. Perhaps mammals work that way. Okay, so how does this apply to my chosen example? So what we, first of all, of course, we have to reify in this way. And one kind of reification that's particularly visible in this is precisely as I've referred to, things like the Omicron strain, the Delta strain, things like that we, in talking, for example, in epidemiology, we will talk about a particular strain. This is a reification because we know that this thing is constantly, this is a constantly evolving process and a diverging process. So there are many different, very diverse objects, if you like, out there that we name in this way. And of course, as I say, these reifications, so that's the first part. The second part, actually that's what I call the second part. The first part is, which way around? so one, the phenomenon to object is, say, the defining something like the Omicron strain, object to phenomenon is trying to understand the epidemiology that's happening by appeal to this epistemic object. And I think the things just we need to be aware of from understanding this way is that there are genuine risks in failing to acknowledge that we have done this kind of reification and taking as literally reference to objects, as again, philosophers have traditionally said. They say we have a word and there's a kind of thing out there that this word refers to, and all done. It's not like that, and it couldn't be like that. And at the end, I will just say very little about a general understanding of what empirically grounded knowledge might be. So reifying viruses, so looking at the two stages, we start with phenomenon to object. I don't know if well, okay, this is the sort of thing that you find. The biomedical visualization studios created the most detailed and scientifically accurate 3D model of the full SARS-CoV-2 virus at atomic resolution. And then it's actually then says it's a more molecular machine than a living organism. So, well, I could show a movie. Would it, or I mean, can I show a movie? It's not necessary. I don't mind if I can't. Well, will it, do you think it's not, okay, maybe. I kind of rather like this because I think it's so, but maybe it's not going to play. No, I think there might be some blocker on.
I accepted it earlier.
Oh, there it goes. Okay, so now here's everything you need to know about the COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Love the music. It's kind of a messy. Everything flows. So, yes, everything flows. I hope this is, I think it's only about a minute. I did rather like it. Anyway, I mean, this is yeah. So I guess this seems to me to be a wonderful example of phenomenon to object reification. But all this data and come up with this thing which we just can see pictures of and we can describe in all kinds of ways. So, but enough of that little interlude. So also then the next stage, of course, is object to phenomenon. When we actually try and think about, this is, I guess, is you could call it a sort of mechanistic model. It says it is. So what is this likely to do? Well, I guess what it is particularly part of is one way of thinking about how we respond to COVID, which is looking at this thing. And then we talk at the end, there are these antibodies, which are other things that are coming to that virus. But there are other ways of thinking about the COVID epidemic. And I think what I would say is more processual ways, where we actually start to think more about the flow of virus through individuals and through hosts. And I guess a little aside there, we also might want to think about co-evolved relations between viruses and hosts. I guess partly I would say because the wonderful natural experiment that COVID provided us is something that we may not have had a history with. So I think lot of the times viral interactions with hosts, we don't really understand them very well because we look at it as a contemporary mechanism rather than understanding that this is the outcome of millions or billions of years of coevolution, and coevolution, much of which may be cooperative rather than parasitic. But anyway, so here is some of the things that I think is fascinating when you start to look in this more dynamic way at what's happening here. So there's actually just a little aside that I might have mentioned earlier, but didn't. Some people actually think the virus is the infected cell. I think that's probably really less promising in the end than thinking it's the virion, because for how much of the cell and so on, but it's also only a part of the life cycle. But one of the things that seems to be true of many viruses, possibly all viruses, is that actually it isn't just the properties of that thing that we just saw so beautifully portrayed, but it's actually in the flow of virus through a host, a lot of its effectiveness is actually a function of its diversity. So that it's the variety of different subtle differences in the flow of virus through you that determines whether your immune system can deal with it. And I guess this has certainly made sense to me when I found this research, the fact of why does it matter how much of a dose of virus you get when you're infected, as was clear certainly in the COVID period. Well, this makes it very sense, just rather like I say, you can't drown in a single drop of water. So how does this kind of different perspective make a difference? Well, of course, viruses, we know, we kind of transfer these objects into very different contexts of research, from the one of the interaction between the virus and maybe a drug, maybe an antibody, into these clearly flow-based sciences like epidemiology and concepts like herd immunity. But actually, there are, in between those, there are, insufficiently discussed, I think, sometimes intermediate flow-based concepts. And one that I found particularly fascinating is that it seems that in this context of the diversity of genomes, mutation rate is a crucial feature of a viral flow. And if it's too little, it's easier for the immune system to deal with it. If it's too great, the virus starts to lose its ability to function. And actually, one nice kind of experiment or experimental idea for actually combating viruses is to find a viral mutagen that will increase the rate of viral mutation to a point where it no longer becomes functional. Well, I would suggest that all of this is just pointing to the fact that thinking of one particular object with one particular mode of behavior and ignoring the diversity, the variability both across time and at a time, kind of closes down the range of options that look plausible. Okay, so one of the general points, and I guess I'm already probably where I should be stopping, and I'm going much too fast through this, but a crucial point of this is that the epistemic objects and the phenomena actually have their own dynamics. So what I hope I've shown pretty clearly is if it didn't need it to be shown, is that the virus as an object is dynamic. So something like the concept Omicron variant is not a kind of something with a constant referent. It's something it refers to something that's changing all the time. Crucially, we do, as researchers, change our concepts. We change. So it's not that nobody's aware of this, of course. And of course, I mean, I'm not trying to tell science they didn't know. I'm trying to tell things some of them did know and how to regain, to improve their thinking about them by paying attention to certain things. And so the scientific research does, of course, try and track these changes. But the crucial thing is when the epistemic objects are taking a life of their own, and this is something we would explore, and I'm only just mentioning this, not discussing, by looking at the process of scientific research, the ways in which scientists try and track these things. These have the life of their own, as do the epistemic objects, something like the concept of the Omicron virus. And the challenge is for making these to track one another. And I think that it's not impossible. I think good science, it very likely does do so, but a lot of the time it doesn't. And I think partly when it doesn't, it's because people are insufficiently attentive to these dynamic aspects. So I'm going to then very, very briefly just gesture at some general sort of philosophical implications for knowledge. So those of philosophers here will probably be familiar with the concept of knowledge as justified through belief. Well, the only point I want to make, and this of course, it goes back to Plato, at least, this kind of idea, and it has kind of a lot of plausibility in thinking, well, what do you know? Well, if you have to have a justification, it has to be true, you have to believe it, and all that. But what we need to focus on is that in a lot of science, our justified true beliefs, as we might say, are really the consequences of this sequence of reifications. So a proposition is, like the Omicron virus has a knobbly spike, right? That is using concepts which are reifications that, just of the kind that we saw in that movie, that are easily taken as referring to kind of timeless external entities by some rigid reference, as philosophers sometimes call it. But it's not like that at all. It's a reification at a time of a particular, of a process that's passing through many different phases. And then when we use these propositions for empirical inquiry, we are doing the reverse reification. We're creating a reified view of the phenomenon based on, so our inquiry, the results of our inquiry are based on these propositions. So I guess I just finally draw attention to some other ways that may be more profitable for thinking about knowledge in this kind of a world. And one person who's particularly important in this, I think, is Ian Hacking, talking about intervention, i.e. focusing on the ways in which we actually interact with the world when doing science, produce changes in the world, and a lot of contemporary work on models. There I quote my collaborator, explanation biology is always obtained through direct intervention on models of the phenomenon to be explained, i.e. the model is an epistemic object with which we constantly deal and which may actually be changing through the processes we expose it to. Funny. Oh, okay. Oh dear. Sorry. Okay. So here's a final last slide. Please know. There's a quote from Hasek Chang: "Knowledge as information may only be flickering moments in the continual creation of use of knowledge as ability, and propositional belief only occasional crystallizations in that flow of activity." And I think this is exactly where we want to get to, i.e. getting away from knowledge as these propositions that are somehow fixed relations between us and the world, and realizing that actually knowing is something we learn to do. So a skilled scientist is actually doing this tracking process, is aligning what he or she is doing to a changing object through their own changing practice and maintaining that relationship in the desired way. And propositional belief is just a momentary reification of that flow of activity. So I think that processual empiricism should require a view of knowledge as ability. This should be grounded on all kinds of interactions between biological processes, particularly researchers and their subjects to important biological processes. And these produce both phenomena and epistemic objects. And finally, the abilities acquired through the practice of science inform researchers' ability to appropriately contextualize and interpret scientific outputs. That's to say, this process of interacting with these dynamic processes gradually hones an ability to track them and maintain the abilities required to provide momentarily adequate accounts of them. And with that, thank you very much.
Very much, John. For questions, I will check online whether there are questions as well in the discussion.
Okay. So I can close this down. Nobody wants cat pictures for too long.
Oh, no, don't close it because if
Oh,
you do, yeah,
sorry.
it will shut down the Zoom.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
no
I'll
problem.
pay the price of my cat. Suffrage. Okay.
First question.
Thank you so much for this. My question is about this last thing you said about the implications for what kind of thing knowledge is, or how you might express it, or how you might think about it. And you said that the expression of knowledge in propositions demands this reification of processes as objects.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Why couldn't we have propositionally expressed knowledge about a process as a whole?
You could, I'm sure, yeah. So processes change. So I guess the point is not so much that you have to think that you're talking about an object, but that in some sense you impose a kind of stasis on the object you're talking about. So I can refer to, a process of inflation, say, but a way I refer to it is a way of referring to it as I now want to discuss it. Maybe as it now is, but at least as I want to now conceive it. But in many dimensions over time, it will be changing. So it's still a momentary snapshot of the process that I'm talking about.
What about a process that is ended? So like historical knowledge, or knowledge about a process that isn't happening anymore. So it's knowledge in history, but it would be expressed as a proposition about a process that is no longer changing.
So that's a very nice question. So yeah, historical phenomenon. Actually, I mean, and I'm committed here to which I am. I on occasion defend a view that's curiously unpopular among contemporary metaphysicians, by which I mean the kind of metaphysicians who sit in armchairs and figure out how the world works. I'm committed to a view that the past is absolutely different from the present and the future. And so I don't think the past changes. I think the future hasn't happened and is not determined, and the present is present. So yes, the process of, the processes in the past are no longer changing. That's absolutely true. All change happens in the present, right? And I mean, so when it happened in the past, it was the present, and when it will happen in the future, it will be the present when it happens. So that's right. Of course, I mean, there is half of this story is still relevant because there's a process of historical research that changes actually our conceptions of the past, but the past doesn't change. That's another nice point. Thank you.
So next question, Martin on Zoom, Martin Zach on Zoom.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I'm not sure if can anybody else.
I don't think, well.
Maybe you can just repeat the question.
Okay, we'll try and keep the question brief so I can remember it and repeat it.
Okay, great. So basically you spoke of the viral cycle as the basis for adopting the process view. And many virologists, for example, seek to develop antiviral drugs by actually studying the viral cycle so as to figure out where they can block that cycle.
Mm-hmm.
So now I'm wondering whether this means that you actually describe scientists as engaged in the process ontology view. Because if that's the case, then my other question or follow-up question would be whether there was a time when scientists were adopting the substance ontology view as opposed to the process view. And if that were the case, then how did such a view look like?
Okay, did you hear that question? Okay, so I think if I can summarize it, the question is, so many scientists do look at the viral life cycle and they're interested in trying to find drugs that will intervene with that. In which case, am I just describing what they do? And I guess also, did they ever think anything different? Because that's what they're doing now. So that sort of a summary. I know it's not lost some nuance there, but okay. So in part, I'm certainly just describing the science. So my conception of how you do ontology is to look at what scientists have found out about the world and try and describe it. And certainly, so clearly, I wouldn't have had a lot of the information I use to make this process argument if scientists hadn't provided the descriptions of the world as a process. So in some important way, I am just describing it. And certainly, there are scientists whose work I'm drawing on who treat the world in that process way. Okay, all that I'm happy to concede. I would say, first of all, that I don't think all scientists think that way. I would also say even some of the scientists who are doing what looks to me like admirable processual research are actually either possibly even hindered, but at best not helped by the fact that they actually don't have a process metaphysics. So they have some kind of cognitive dissonance between what they're doing and how they would tend to describe the world. I like to think of the relationship between ontology and science as something that, for want of at the risk of a slightly antiquated sounding word, is dialectical. And what I mean by that is the metaphysics should, in my view, be derived from the science. It should be grounded on the science, but it should also be, the reason it's worth grounding some metaphysics on the science is because if you then look at the science that's being done in the light of the metaphysics, the hope is that it will suggest new ways of thinking about it, perhaps better ways of thinking about it, perhaps critical approaches to some science that is too deeply grounded in a misguided metaphysics. I think, as a matter of fact, that if you ask a lot of virologists, I haven't talked to them for quite a while, but when I have talked to them, many of them will say the virus is the virion. I mean, as after all, this movie, I think, is pretty clearly saying there's the COVID-19, and it's a virus, and it's a kind of machine. And of course, that actually reflects a ton of useful knowledge about this process. So I'm not criticizing people for producing this, but I think that the way it's presented makes one think of certain ways of responding to it rather than others. And of course, I say there are other ways of responding it because other scientists are responding to it in other ways. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a complicated relation, but I certainly don't want to think of myself as saying, here's some metaphysics. You scientists don't get it, so do something completely different. I want to say, here's a whole bunch of science, which is really cool and gives us a broader view of the world, which is, in a sense, what I think as philosophers, we're often interested in doing, is providing as coherent as possible, a general picture of what science is telling us. But then also, this has a role in enabling us to see where science could be done differently, perhaps even could be done better.
Thanks. Can I have just a short follow-up? Is that possible?
Very quickly, please, Martin, we have other questions in the room, but you can.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'm just wondering if you could give some very specific example of what would change in the scientific practice of those virologists, for instance, who don't seem to adopt the process view. So how adopting the process view would actually impact their daily business?
Well, so the question is, can I give a specific example of how a processual view? So I'm not going to say, here's a way of doing virology that isn't being done, right? I'm going to say what I did say. Here are some virologists who are coming up with some really surprising approaches to dealing with the virus, interacting with the virus. And I think that this is the kind of thing you should pay a lot of attention to if you are really thinking adequately about the dynamic nature of the virus. So the stories I was recounting about, for example, the lethal mutagenesis. I mean, it's not that, obviously some scientists have come up with that, that's what I'm quoting, but I'm thinking this is the kind of thing that looks like the sort of practice that might be really important, really valuable in a process world. Whereas also, it's also the case that, as we know, the kind of approach of finding a drug that kind of interacts in a neutralizing way with the pathogenic agent is actually constantly limited by the fact that the pathogenic agent is constantly changing. And as we know with like antimicrobial resistance, this is, and I could say a lot more about that if you want, but this is something that is in a way, a more substance-based view. Here's the virus, how do we deal with it? Well, no, because the virus isn't that way anymore. It keeps changing. So we might actually want to focus much more on ways of intervening in the flow at either the population or the individual level, rather than looking at this thing and trying to figure out how we can neutralize it. Because by the time we've done that, it may be something quite different.
Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. I was wondering if maybe you could unpack a little bit how you might articulate. This kind of seems to be that you're talking about what viruses are in themselves, en soi. How you might articulate that with, let's say, a more of a perspectival or promiscuous realism point of view, where, for example, an immune cell takes a virus to be one thing, we take it to be another, a cell that could be infected, that it offers different affordances, and within each of those, the virus seems to be a different thing in each of those perspectives. But you seem to be trying to go for an in itself. What is a virus in itself?
Well, I hope I think I failed to communicate, because I certainly agree with the implications of your question, and I certainly would not think of myself as saying what it is en soi. I mean, I think, okay, so I'll say it's a process, but that's not saying so is everything else. So I'm not saying anything very distinctive about the virus when I say that. But when, for example, I say it's not in itself a parasite or a mutualist, that actually is something that changes according to context, I'm precisely saying something unlike that. And that's I take it, quite promiscuously realist. So I don't think, apart from saying it's a process, which is just part of saying everything is a process, and that's something that we always need to think about when doing science. I don't think I wanted to say, I think everything I said was intended to go in the way you suggested I should go, i.e. precisely denying the idea that there is some essence of the thing that we can identify.
Maybe then just if you could explain what the process philosophy adds then to, for example, how we think about a virus that you, for example, didn't already have with promiscuous.
Okay, this is because I guess not everybody here probably knows what promiscuous realism is. This is a term that I think sorry?
Can you maybe just give the people on Zoom a quick idea of the question?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Well, maybe I'll give a really brief summary of it, which is just that the question was, well, maybe I just give the final version, which is there anything that this perspective adds to the promiscuous realism that I've advocated in the past? I'm sorry, I hope that's not too reductive a view of you. So promiscuous realism was still is the idea that there is no one way of classifying things, that how you classify the world is dependent on why you're doing it. And very unpopularly among some philosophy of science colleagues, I originally sort of illustrated this with things like kind of food classifications. And for example, the classifications of what is an onion and what is a garlic really doesn't map onto the biological world, because there's a whole bunch of different species scattered around. So either of these would make horribly polyphyletic categories. So, and I said, but they're essential categories because you couldn't cook without them. But I also argue that all the problem people have with species definitions comes about because there are different perspectives that call for different ways of classifying the world into species. Okay, so I think of this as very much connected with the process view. I think part of what happened to me, as we're kind of inviting a little autobiography, is when I was developing promiscuous realism, I was very interested in critiquing certain then still quite popular views about reductionism, determinism, everything having an essence which said exactly what it was, and various theses. And I think, though I said that our scientific practices and knowledge gave us reasons to reject these views, I tended to think that was just sort of just a matter of chance. I mean, not chance, but it was just a contingent matter that the world was that way, where it was a bit of a mess and things didn't fit into nice categories, and there were different ways of doing things. It could have been as people then thought it was, but it just didn't happen to be. What emerged, I think, for me in my process work is actually all of these, I mean, something I certainly thought of before, that these set of views that I was criticizing came out of a metaphysical worldview. It was actually, I now like to call it deliberately, abusively, the billiard ball world, because I tend to think, though nobody actually believes in billiard balls exactly, most of the kind of Laplacian billiard ball world is still guiding the way people see science. What the process worldview says is that if that's how the world is, and all the evidence I would say is that it is, then the kind of position I described as promiscuous realism is exactly what you'd expect. If you have a world of kind of basically chaos in which order emerges under particular circumstances for short times, then you can describe those bits of order as best you can, but there's no reason to suppose that they somehow fit in any obvious way with another bit of order that's emerged somewhere else. So it's basically, I suppose, so the subtitle of my book, where I did the promiscuous, outlined Promiscuous readers was called The Disorder of Things, Metaphysical Foundations of the Disunity of Science. What I now really think is I probably didn't really have the metaphysical foundations. In fact, it was more epistemological foundations of the disorder of the world. And what I'm actually doing now is providing metaphysical foundations of the disunity of science. I said that off the top of my head, and I don't know if it made sense, but I'll come back, I'll come and reflect that.
Makes sense to me, at least. Sophie?
Yes, I was wondering, can we think about anthropomorphism as a reification process?
I mean, sure, the answer is yes. I suppose what that though would be is, I suppose, an inherently bad reification process. Is that, I mean, and of course, I mean, reification has a tradition of being used to refer to, you know, things that on the whole we don't like, right? So I guess a bit like objectification, which is perhaps the word one could have used too. So absolutely, yes. And I suppose one of the interesting things about making that example is that it does show we always have to be critical of reifications. That doesn't mean some of them aren't useful and entirely functional, but we always have to keep track of the fact that we're doing it. And I think anthropomorphism would be a very clear example. There probably are cases where it's a useful strategy, but if we forget that that's what we're doing, we'll end up talking nonsense very soon, I guess.
Mathieu?
Yes, you propose to change not only our conception of entities from things to processes, but also our conception of scientific knowledge itself, from true belief to ability. And so in that perspective, how do you address the usual issue of relativism and demarcation between science and pseudoscience?
That's a big question.
Mathieu, you've forgotten the instruction.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, I mean, this is one of the interesting things about your question, which is a kind of, I'm trying to evade it very slightly and trying to think of something to say, is that, of course, this is relates to the earlier question about promiscuous realism, because people would tend to say the same thing. You mean any old set of concepts and is perfectly good science? And the answer, I guess, to both is, well, you have to judge the effectiveness. You have to judge whether you are successfully tracking the world, whether your activities as a scientist are functioning in that way, in that slightly different way. So whether your practice is adequate to your goals. And I think, you know, I don't think there is a simple answer to just differentiating science from non-science. But by that I mean, there are cases which are quite hard to adjudicate. On the other hand, I think there are cases that are pretty easy to adjudicate. I mean, apologies to any anti-vaxxers in the room, but I don't think that that's a scientific view in any sense, because we have overwhelming evidence that this is an extraordinarily effective therapy. Or I guess maybe it's not therapy for COVID, preventative. So yeah, I think as with so many things in a dynamic world, we shouldn't expect sharp boundaries. And you know, whether and you know, I'm even prepared to be open to the thought that some people doing rather weird kinds of medicine may have effective practices. I think we should at least look empirically at them and see whether they're effective. Obviously, in many cases, it seems extraordinarily improbable because we have no idea how they could possibly work. But I don't think that anything is taken away from our ability to look at a particular allegedly knowledge-producing practice and ask whether it's really producing knowledge in the sense of empowering effective activity of a knowledgey, of an epistemic sort. So I don't know, I hope that was.
Do we have other questions? Fridolin?
So you were just saying that the process metaphysics in a way provides the actual metaphysics to your earlier views. Does that actually mean that there's less disorder, and the disorder comes from the dissonance between a thing epistemology and the process, underlying process?
I don't want to say too much about this because I'm actually working on a paper now. So in some ways, yes. So one of the, I mean, so here's one, and I'm sure this is a trailer, maybe something. But so one thing people always used to say, which is rather annoying from my earlier work, was, you know, this can't be right. There's only one world after all. And I mean, obviously that's true, though trying to figure out why people felt inclined to say it was always a struggle for me. Well, I guess what I now have is an answer to that question. Absolutely. It's a world essentially of mostly chaos, out of which little pockets of order emerge. Does that mean, but I still think the world is highly just as disordered as I thought it was. It's just the disorder is the metaphysics, not the lack of metaphysics, as it were. So yeah, I mean, mostly I think it's just that I really didn't have a particularly coherent metaphysics at that point. It was mostly negative. And so I didn't really know what to say about the sense in which the world was, you know, there was one world or not. I didn't understand the question, but now I think I'm comfortable saying absolutely, and here's what it's like, and how long have you got?
Is that?
Well, thank you for your lecture. I've got a less general, more concrete question.
There's always the hard ones.
The notion of the virus as a part of a holobiont.
Yeah.
And you kind of put as opposites the view of virus as a parasite and a view as a stabilizing agent, which contributes to holobiont. But how to deal with cases where, for example, viruses or other organisms may lead, for example, to chronic infections, where certainly there is some work of stabilization of some condition, but it's certainly the harmful condition. And whether we can call them parts of holobiont or stabilizing agent, and still call them parasites.
So they're stabilizing the pathological traits of the organism. Well, if you'll give me that description, then I'm comfortable, because I mean, I said there were two criteria. One is the kind of temporal extension of the relationship, and the other is that it should be beneficial. Now, maintaining a pathological trait surely isn't beneficial. So not all stabilization is beneficial. I mean, I can, you know, if I toss you in a deep freeze, that's stabilizing you in a certain way, but is not beneficial. So yeah, I think does that? Okay.
If there's any last question, we have time for last question and quick answer. Questions online? Doesn't seem to be any question online. Okay, so let's thank you, John. And